Thanks, Deepak. So let me just briefly introduce myself and what I've been doing before I move into the topic I chose to present today. So I'm basically a data scientist and a rural development professional from India. I've been working in tech for good space for about 13 years now, applying digital technologies in diverse fields such as sustainable agriculture, poverty alleviation, tribal development, and climate resilience. I have started my career basically at grassroots level in tiger reserve forest, working for particularly vulnerable tribal groups and trying to introduce them to agriculture because they were into hunting and food gathering. So my journey in agriculture began with the primitive tribal groups. I worked on one of the finest digital technologies as well, that is used for really large-scale implementation of social security programs like Manrega, which is the largest one in the world. And back then, we've been using, biometric payments, facial recognition, geotagging of assets, algorithms for fraud detection. So really cutting-edge technologies way back in 2008 when I started off. And this was before the smartphone era. Later on, I moved to the Prime Minister's office, PMO, and started working at the policy level, drafting national legislations, the key one being the land acquisition and rehabilitation. I have also had a brief stint, like you, Deepak, as an entrepreneur in skill development and youth employment domain. Later on, I have moved to US where I have studied and also worked as a data scientist at Yale University, doing climate modeling and crop modeling using machine learning algorithms. And then I joined UNDP, which is my current role, working as head of experimentation, leading design of various innovative experiments to tackle various social and environmental challenges. These experiments basically convey what works and what does not work, and it informs various stakeholders in the development programming, stakeholders being UNDP, in-house programs, as well as partners. So this is my very basic introduction of what I've been doing in the last 13 years in the development sector, which includes a lot of work around agriculture. So thank you so much for inviting me to the Women in Agriculture Summit. It is so refreshing because most of the agriculture summits I have been to had more than 80% as men. So participating in all women agri summit is a very interesting one for me. It's an absolute pleasure to share the stage with all the accomplished women in the field of agriculture today. So thank you for having me here. So the topic I have chosen for today's discussion presentation is at the intersection of agriculture, gender, climate change, and digital. It has to be at the intersection because I come from various backgrounds and I'm a very interdisciplinary professional. So to me, agriculture, especially climate resilient agriculture, which is serving the women farmers or the Mahila Kisan in Hindi, is very, very close to my heart. It is very important because we are operating in a very complex environment. As you see, the temperatures are soaring. Extreme weather incidents and impact of heat waves is already being experienced in various cities of North America as we speak. Agriculture, in fact, is also severely impacted by climate change, and it also causes it. If you go to the Economic Survey of India, I guess in 2017, the survey had already cautioned that the climate change might be reducing annual agriculture income by 25% especially for unirrigated areas in the country. Now that's a very serious concern and requires a lot of attention. And this is not a very short-term problem, but it's a long-term one which we have to work on systematically. We have to also acknowledge that agriculture in India causes about 17% of greenhouse gas emissions. So there is a cause as well as effect of the climate change on agriculture. And the 17% when we say is also a conservative estimate because it does not include stubble burning. And at the same time, when we look at water related issues, we also see that Indian agriculture is using more than 2 to 3 times more water to produce 1 ton of food when compared to major agricultural nations. So water efficiency is definitely not something that we should be proud of. And that's a serious concern too. So I guess this is where we need a lot more interventions, programs, and innovations that are focused in climate resilient agriculture systems. Now, amidst all the factors that we see that are worsening in Indian agriculture, be it monocropping or depletion of soil health, depletion of water table, or indiscriminatory use of fertilizers, pesticides, growing pathogen, pest attack, there are many more issues. But however, there is one ray of hope. And to me, that is Mahila Kisan, the women farmers. Now, my experience in managing, pan-India sustainable agriculture program under NRLM, National Rural Livelihoods Mission, has taught me that women farmers and women collectives, actually, when they are equipped with the right capacities, can become better agents of change in sustainable agriculture and in building climate resilience. So to me, that's a very, very important factor. We know that as farmers, laborers, entrepreneurs, in different roles, women play a very important role in agriculture. We are increasingly seeing feminization of agriculture in India, especially in the dryland areas where soil is unproductive, rains are erratic, they are insufficient, and the men have migrated in search of work to cities, leaving agriculture and allied activities to women. As collectors of water, fodder, domestication of crops, choosing the right seed variety, women have always played a very important role in the health of especially the rain-fed and the dryland farms. But however, there are several constraints that women farmers face. There are many constraints in accessing land, accessing credit, technology, agriculture inputs, services, market opportunities, many more. According to Oxfam, actually 80% of economically active women in India are employed informally in agriculture sector. However, less than 11% own land, which is the most important household asset. Now, we can easily see the wide gap between the participation vis-a-vis ownership in agriculture for women. In fact, one of our UNDP research is also pointing to widening gap of poverty between men and women in South Asia, especially because of the pandemic. Now, according to some of the projections, for every 100 men in the age group of 25 to 34 living in poverty in Southern Asia, there will be 129 poor women in 2021. So the pandemic is increasing this gap, which was already quite wide before the pandemic. It is much more harder for women to access agriculture credit when compared to men. There's one research actually done by one of the major banks that shows that women need to pay 4 or 5 more visits to a bank vis-a-vis men to access loans. And let me suggest you a very practical experiment. Open your Google. Go to Google Images and just search for KVK Farm School or KVK Farmer. Now, KVK, as we all know, are the Krishi Vigyan Kendras. Now, these are very, very important channels and important agencies for knowledge dissemination and technology transfer in India. But however, if you go to their Google Images and try to see what KVK trainings look like or what KVK farmer looks like, you will see mostly men. At least 80% of those images show you men, right? So if these are anyhow indicative of what is happening on the ground, you see that women are not part of this conversation, mainstream conversation happening in agriculture. They're always on the fringes. So we have to tackle these issues very systematically. And what I have seen from my experience in working with NRLM was that, organizing, collectivizing and capacitating women can help us solve a lot of problems. We need a lot more customized programs and gender-based investment in agriculture for women farmers. We also need to channelize investments into integrated program approaches that address various things like sustainable agriculture practices, nutrition, natural resource management, biodiversity, drudgery reduction, food processing, local economic development. And when we do this entire set of things in a very integrated way and focused on women, we will definitely see a big change. We also need greening of agriculture value chains, because often we see that we tend to think that, okay, climate change is impacting production system, not so much of a supply chain and the market systems, but that is not true. We need to have the greening of agriculture value chains also post-harvest and at the distribution level. And these need to be gender sensitive, because we are seeing more and more feminization of agriculture, especially in India. And finally, coming to my current area of work, which is in digital farming and emerging technologies. Basically, as women in STEM as well as agriculture, I'm very excited to see some of the new possibilities, some of the possibilities that were not existing 5 years back. We are seeing a lot of penetration of smartphones. We are seeing 5G internet connectivity, cloud computing, open data. We are seeing open source technologies. So this is very, very exciting space. Now, during COVID as well, we have seen many consumers, businesses adopting digital modes very, very quickly. And why not, when we have more than 600 million users of smartphones in the country, and internet is very cheap. Internet is less than 30 cents per gigabytes of data. Now, when my American friends visit me in India, they are very, very surprised to see how cheap internet is in the country. While this is all promising and the digital transition is very important for overall development of the country, I should say it has not been equitable. We still see that less than 1/3 of rural women have used internet at least once, which means 2/3 of the rural women have never been on internet. They had never accessed internet. Now, against this, you see that only 1/3 men did not access internet. So there's already a huge, digital gender divide in the country. You can imagine during the pandemic how huge this could have been in terms of opportunity divide, be it education, be it work, because everything is becoming tech, like, agri-tech, food tech, edu-tech, fintech. So when everything is tech and the tech is growing at a fast pace, especially because of due to the pandemic and the lockdowns, we are seeing that a large number of women are not part of it because they do not have access to internet. So like others, while I was very excited about predictive intelligence and better, advisory to the farmers, better geospatial applications, IoT-based farming, blockchain for traceability, drones. So these are super exciting for me, especially as an engineer and a data scientist. But we need to remember that when we do this, there is a high probability that these technologies and services are not reaching Mahila Kisan. There is a high probability. I'm not saying that none of us are doing it, but just look at the chance of reaching there. Now at UNDP, while we are designing such innovations, we often consult women farmers and design women-centric digital applications. Many don't even have simple mobile. Forget about smartphones. They don't even have simple mobile phones. So they require delivery mechanisms through community assistants, whose capacities again in turn need to be built. So if we are not thinking through these dynamics, we are building very, very biased systems against women. So what at a much more nuanced level, we are also seeing gender bias cropping up in the data sets. Related but a distant example, let's take credit scores. Credit scores. Women actually tend to have lower credit scores than men with similar credentials and financial status. So there is research from US which is actually reporting this in a very systematic way. The parameters determining credit score don't include gender. So it seems gender neutral, right? But why is this happening? So in the US, we have found that women spend less, they earn less, and this affects their credit utilization. This in turn impacts your credit score. Now, this pattern would have come out strongly if gender as a variable was included in the design. Now, gender neutral is what the designer would be thinking while devising the system. But gender neutral does not mean you're not looking at gender. If you're not looking at gender, you're not getting the full picture of all the variables of potential gender bias in your model. And this is very important because it ultimately impacts your creditworthiness, your opportunities, and your progress. So this is one example coming from US. Of course, we do not have such concrete examples in India because we are at a very nascent stage in terms of building such ecosystems, data ecosystems. But however, we have to be very, very careful about these nuances that creep in models and data sets. It may seem like gender neutral, it may seem like everything is fair, but then the interactions among the variables are much more complex. So this is where I would say that it's important to be gender sensitive and not gender blind. So in my experience as data scientist as well, introducing gender as variable in different models, they yield different results. We need to actually address this and promote more and more research on dealing with, imbalanced data, applying counterfactual fairness and iterative modeling. So these are all important, and these are not taught in the mainstream data science courses. Moving further, in the era of artificial intelligence, the structural gender bias challenges will get more and more tricky. We have to address historical bias, algorithmic bias, as well as bias of modelers, because most of them are men. I have noticed that such nuanced gender biases in models and algorithms are not easily detected by conventional data scientists or social scientists or even agriculture scientists. We need many more professionals at the intersections of these disciplines to look into these nuances. Right now, across the world, we have less than 20% of the data scientists who are women. So there's a disparity there as well. So we need to have a lot more female data scientists to address complexity around the gender bias in the data. And we need a lot more interdisciplinary professionals to address the gender disparities in the agriculture sector as a whole. Thank you.
Very well articulated, Swetha, coming from a woman, the bias in the system as well as the algorithmic world about women. That was refreshing to understand and hear from you. And congratulations for putting these very pertinent points on the table. I've got some questions, right? Coming from our viewers as well as my team itself. The first question we would like to understand, because as you rightly pointed out, algorithms which we are talking about today are getting biased, right? Definitely the gender bias you have talked about one example. There are many examples, right? The way how the shopping is being done, right? Maybe not immediately relevant to agriculture, but even the tracking of the consumers while they're shopping, and then the creeping up of gender bias there is very much talked about. Also, there are challenges about the bias towards the model when it comes to non-sustainable agriculture also, right? Because for decades we have been talking about high yields at cost of anything, right? At cost of environment, as cost, you mentioned beautifully well about the water challenges, right? So we have been abusing water like anything to, again, with the fascination of getting more yields without realizing that actually we are using far more water than what is required. How do you see that these biases in going forward, because AI is going to become more and more also that commonplace? How do you see these challenges being solved? And are the organization like UN, United Nations, or FAO, or ASEAN Secretariat, or African Union, or European Union, are they even thinking in those directions, how to counter these biases which AI tools would putting and unleashing on us?
Definitely, Deepak, that's a very, very pertinent issue. We have been seeing biases in various sectors, and the digital biases is no surprise, right? And as we move further, the biases will get more and more nuanced. And at the same time, there'll be, it will be a lot more difficult to detect such biases. And at UNDP, we are constantly thinking about this. In fact, our UNRC, the resident coordinator, she's very, very particular about algorithmic bias, and fairness in algorithms and aspects like this, especially related to gender. So definitely there are a lot of black box algorithms and models that seem to be very accurate, that seem to be giving good results, but then they do have like a historical bias, right? So while bias is one thing, accuracy is another thing, fairness is another component. So I think moving forward, we need a lot more research on issues on fairness, issues on accountability, issues on transparency, ethics, explainable AI, right? Because you have to explain the cause and effect. Why are we seeing results in a particular way and not in any other way? So the explainability factor will become more and more important as we go further. And I guess a lot of research is happening abroad, in US, and I come from Yale University. So there's been a lot of emphasis on issues related to fate concerns in AI. So having said that, UN in India is also working very closely on the legal aspects and the regulation aspects related to the fate concern. So how do we make the entity that is designing this accountable, right? Whom do we make accountable moving further? Because we are moving into more and more automated world. So how can we hold algorithms accountable? We can't hold them accountable. So whom do we hold accountable? So these are some of the discussions that we are having also at the policy level, at the UN level in India. So it's a very exciting space. At the same time, it's a very, very concerning space to be in.
I fully agree with, because I myself had the experience when I was interacting with stakeholders at multilateral agencies, that there is a lot of confusion and there is a lot of still gray areas, right, of identifying the way forward. Everybody knows about the challenges of these biases, but how to start tackling that has always been a multi-billion question for everyone. I'll say holy grail of AI. Our next question is about sustainable agriculture. There have been a lot of talk about regenerative agriculture, circular economy. What's your view as a researcher on these? That because you work and you've seen on ground how things move in a developing country like India, where the farmers are struggling even to get their ends met, right? And they are being I'll say that having challenge of their livelihood itself. And in that, if you are trying to float an idea, right, which is counter to what they have been taught for past 4 decades, right, and suddenly saying that don't do the tilling or start doing non-till farming, or suddenly we start saying that the carbon sequestration is more important than actually getting a product on the table. So how do you see, in your experience as a researcher, acceptance or scalability of these new ideas and adoption, especially when it comes to women farmers?
Yeah, that's a very, very deep question, actually. Takes me back to early 2010s and 12s, when we were working very keenly on the sustainable agriculture program, especially focused on women. So we have noticed that, of course, technology adoption, any new set of package of practices does not happen easily. It's not something by default that you give a manual and everything changes the next day. So there is a lot of behavioral change that happens. There's a lot of technology adoption, any new practice or even old practice, from any change from the status quo is very, very difficult, especially in agriculture. And what we have seen is in women-owned farms, there is already, a great extent of focus on food and nutrition security for own family. Right. So the way decisions are made, the way they approach the problem of agriculture is different from that of farms run by men. So women-headed farms were, for us, easier to convince on sustainable agriculture practices, because the use of the chemicals, the use of indiscriminate use of pesticides is all the lower end. At the same time, they have been using traditional variety. And some of these old practices that we want to bring to the modern era are kind of being practiced already in certain pockets of, say, Jharkhand, interior pockets, in the central tribal belt of India. If you see Jharkhand, Chhattisgarh, parts of Madhya Pradesh, then parts of Gujarat, the tribal area in Gujarat, So there we have seen that it is easier for us to propagate these ideas of sustainable agriculture, and more so with women-owned farms, because they are sensitive to the food and nutrition requirements of their own family and community. So it's easier to pitch these ideas to them, and at the same time, they're very, very hardworking. So you know that sometimes you come across more weed, you have to put in more manual labor, but they are willing to go that extra mile. And they're also able to understand better the long-term repercussions of their land, if certain practices continue. If we need to change those practices, we need to adopt more and more sustainable agriculture practices for long-term gain. So the idea of long-term gain is better understood by women farmers when compared to men farmers. So that's why I keep emphasizing on Mahila Kisan as the agents of change and the big, big hope for climate resilient agriculture systems.
No, I fully agree. In fact, we are doing farming on ground, and we see some of the nuanced activities. Women farmers are far better when actually compared to their male counterpart, especially when we talk about the seeding, right? The hand sowing, right? If you tell say 10 women farmers, right, to do the seeding at say 4 inch for garlic, right, or a turmeric, right, and 90% of the time you'll find that they have done that. But the same thing when you pass to the male farmers, you'll find that 30% of them would have done it. 70% would have been doing it at maybe 2 inch or 2.5 inch, right? So I believe women are more precise, and they are having this holistic view of doing farming with more focused on, I'll say that overall good rather than just personal good. In fact, I think there is saying also which says that if you teach a man farming, he'll feed his family. If you teach women farming, she'll feed whole society. So I think that is having definitely in current context a value. Now that brings me to my last question. How do you see at the top of the pyramid, right, where you're sitting, when you're heading a specific activity of a very tall institution? Do you see biases even at those levels, or you see that biases are only at lower level of the pyramid?
That's a very difficult question to answer. And let me put it a little more diplomatically for this one. There are definitely biases at all levels. But then those biases also need to be, addressed systematically with evidence. So that is where I guess at UN level or at the policy circles that we interact with the right amount of evidence, with the right kind of evidence, and with the right kind of anecdotes as well, I think we can bring a change in the thought process. So this is what we have seen. Biases are definitely there everywhere because it doesn't naturally occur to you, right? When you think of farmer, you think of a male farmer. A lot of people do. I think we have to do a survey on this. Perception of what is the definition of farmer according to you. What do you imagine, right? So we need to constantly remind people through various ways. We use images of only women farmers in most of our programs. On social media, you see, when we talk about farmers, we talk about women farmers only in UNDP. So we have this sort of a systematic policy to kind of change that mindset. It has to come visually, it has to come through multiple means. So usually what we do is when we are designing any women-centric policies, women-centric interventions, we visualize farmers who are women, women farmers who are not highly educated, basically, educated enough to just do her signature. We think of the women farmer who is operating in dry land ecosystem, a farmer who does not own a phone, right? A farmer who does not have easy access to credit or the best of the markets. And then we start building interventions, programs around this particular character. At the same time, when we are doing it, we also make sure that we include some of the women farmers in our conversations. It's very important, to have this sort of an engagement even in the policy discussions. So even before UN, when I was working with the NRLM, we had this active agenda. Whatever be the policy discussion, we always have a couple of women farmers, let's say from Bihar, from Jharkhand, from a dryland ecosystem, to see if what we are talking doesn't make sense to them or not, on the ground. So we need to have that sort of practical checks at each and every point. And there are no easy solutions to tackling bias. We have to do it through multiple ways. And the best is to involve the woman farmer herself. So they speak very well when it comes to their challenges. So, and then it's our responsibility to tackle them, very precisely to the point and not just through indirect means.
Perfect. Thanks, Swetha. It was a pleasure having you on this session for Women in Agriculture. We appreciate you participating and talking your heart out. And I'm pretty sure you would have galvanized at least quite a few number of youngsters to follow your footsteps. Thanks a lot. And thanks for participation.
Thank you, Deepak, for having me here. Thank you.